By the autumn of 1884, the silver boom in Arizona Territory was running on paper. Production reports were filed for claims that had been abandoned. Supply orders were sent to depots that no longer held the materials listed. And the women who had been pressed into the invisible architecture of the mining economy, the telegraph operators, the camp cooks, the bookkeepers without official titles, the nurses who were called something else because no one had gotten around to naming what they actually did, found themselves standing in the open when the machinery finally stopped. It did not stop dramatically. That is the first thing to understand about the way things ended at Harrow Creek Silver Mine in October of 1884. There was no single moment of collapse, no explosion, no confrontation. There was instead a progressive thinning of authority, like water finding its way through stone, until one morning Constance Caldwell woke before dawn in the telegraph shack and realized that the last man with the power to tell her what to do next had saddled his horse and ridden out sometime in the night. She did not know this immediately. She knew it the way you know a fire has gone cold before you look at it, because the particular quality of the silence had changed. She dressed in the dark and walked to the main office and found the door open and the desk cleared and a half-eaten meal left on the corner table, as though whoever had been sitting there had meant to come back. She stood in the doorway for a moment. The sky above the canyon walls was the color of iron, the hour before first light, when the stars have already faded but the sun has not yet committed to appearing. She could hear the sound of the wind moving through the scrub pine on the ridge above. Nothing else. She went back to her equipment and sent one final transmission to the central office in Tucson, 300 miles away by wire Harrow Creek status, unknown, requesting instructions. She received an acknowledgement that the message had been received. She received no instructions. She sat in the chair and waited for a response that did not come for 2 hours, and when it came, it said only that a military escort would be sent to the area within 48 hours, and that all civilian personnel should remain in place. She sent back, understood. She did not know if anyone was left to escort. She was not certain she was anyone. The other women arrived at the telegraph shack in ones and twos over the next hour, drawn by the same logic that draws people toward the point in a space where information might exist. There were 11 of them from Harrow Creek alone. 6 more joined them across the following morning from 2 smaller claims in the canyon, having walked several miles on roads that no longer had anyone patrolling them. They were carrying whatever they had managed to gather in the time available for gathering, which in most cases was not much. A coat, a tin of food, in one case a small framed photograph that a woman named Rosamond Quillen held against her chest with both hands for most of the 40-mile journey to Fort Bowie, as though she were afraid it might be taken from her. Constance did not know Rosamond before that morning. She would know her well before the month was out, though not in any way she would have predicted. The military escort arrived in the form of 6 soldiers on horseback and a wagon. They were not unkind and they were not welcoming. They were busy, which in that particular autumn meant they were preoccupied with the larger mechanics of a region that had been operating in a state of controlled tension for years and was now in various ways releasing that tension all at once. The sergeant in charge of the escort told Constance, who had positioned herself near the front of the group because she had the most information about the route and had decided someone ought to be positioned to share it, that they would be taken to Fort Bowie for processing and then transferred to the nearest town with civilian accommodations. She asked what processing involved. He said he wasn't sure exactly, that it was handled by the command there. She said how long. He said he didn't know that either. She nodded and relayed the information to the group behind her, in terms that were slightly more reassuring than what she had actually been told, not because she wanted to deceive anyone, but because she understood in the way that telegraph operators understand things, that the information people receive needs to be calibrated to what they can act on. Information you cannot act on delivered without context produces panic. Panic produces poor decisions. She had learned this not from any book, but from 2 years of being the person responsible for transmitting messages that could mean the difference between a shipment arriving on time and a payroll failing to reach men who were already angry. She had come to Arizona at 20 years old because the pay was twice what she could earn in Cincinnati, and because her father, who had spent his life as a railroad telegraph operator in Ohio, had taught her that information was a form of power that did not require physical strength to carry and could be learned by anyone patient enough to listen. He had meant the remark as general encouragement, She had taken it as professional advice. By the time she arrived at Harrow Creek, she could receive 40 words per minute in Morse code with her eyes closed, and she had developed the particular kind of calm that comes not from the absence of fear, but from the presence of something to do. She was doing that now, observing, organizing, transmitting what could be transmitted. The escort moved the group south toward the fort, and Constance walked near the front and watched the landscape and listened and noted the positions of things. It was habit. She had been doing it since childhood. The inventory of any new space exits. Information points the person in the room most likely to know what was happening. She did not know yet that this habit would matter more in the next 2 weeks than in any of the previous 22 years of her life combined. Fort Bowie in October of 1884 was not the frontier outpost of popular imagination. It was a working military installation, functional and unglamorous, with adobe buildings arranged around a central parade ground and a surrounding wall that had been built more for administrative clarity than for any serious defensive purpose. The war that the fort had been built to manage was in a particular phase that the men stationed there had learned to describe as containment, which meant that the larger confrontations had ended, but the smaller ones had not, and no one could say with confidence when the smaller ones would end or what that ending would look like. The 17 women were brought through the south gate in the early afternoon and taken to a building near the eastern wall that had most recently served as a storage facility for quartermaster supplies. The supplies had been moved out sometime in the past week. The shelves along the walls had been cleared. The floor was hardwood, wide planks worn smooth by years of use and heavy loads, and it was clean in the way that spaces are clean when they have been swept recently, but not in any time before that. The windows were set high in the walls, rectangular and unshuttered, emitting the slanted October light at an angle that caught the dust still settling from whatever activity had cleared the room. There were no chairs. There were no blankets. There were 2 wooden buckets of water near the right wall, which was enough for immediate needs and not enough for the rest of the day. Constance walked to the window on the left side of the room, the lowest of the 3, and sat down on the floor beneath it. From that position, she could see both the interior of the room and through the glass above her, a portion of the yard beyond the eastern gate. She did this without making a production of it. She sat down and put her back against the wall and looked at the space around her and cataloged what it contained. Millicent Stanwyck sat down in the center of the room. This was also a choice, though it looked like nothing at all. In any group of people placed in an undefined situation, the person who occupies the center occupies something more than physical space. Millicent had been managing the kitchen at Denton Creek for 9 years, which meant she had been the organizing intelligence of a community for 9 years, and the habits of that work did not stop operating simply because the context had changed. She sat in the center of the room with her back straight and her hands in her lap and said nothing, and within 20 minutes the other women had arranged themselves around her in a rough pattern that placed her at the middle of something. Constance noticed this. She also noticed that Millicent noticed her noticing it, and that for approximately 1 second, the 2 women looked at each other across the floor of the room with the particular attention of people who are performing a rapid and mutual assessment. Then they both looked away. It was not a confrontation. It was something more like a recognition. Constance had been the woman with the most information at Harrow Creek, which had given her a functional authority for the past 2 days that no one had officially granted her. Millicent had been the woman with the most experience at Denton Creek, which had given her something similar for the past 9 years. They were now in the same room, and neither of them knew yet what that meant. A young soldier appeared at the door. He was perhaps 19 years old, slight and pale, with the look of someone who had not yet fully grown into his uniform. He walked the perimeter of the room with his eyes forward and his hands at his sides and said nothing. And when he had completed his circuit, he returned to his position near the door and stood there. 5 of the women who had been talking when he entered had stopped talking when he appeared and did not resume until he was back in his position and his attention had returned to the middle distance. Constance watched this and did not stop talking because she had not been talking to begin with. She was watching. She watched the soldier who was Private Wendell Ashworth, though she did not yet know his name, and she watched Millicent, and she watched Keturah Fairchild, who was 27 and had worked as a seamstress at Harrow Creek, and who made a small movement toward the door at some point in the first hour, some intention of going to ask about water or food or the schedule, or any of the things that none of them had been told. And Millicent looked at her once, just once, and Keturah sat back down. Constance recorded this without comment. The question she was asking herself was not whether Millicent was right or wrong to establish that particular order. The question was structural: what kind of authority was being established, on what basis, and whether it would remain useful as the situation developed. These were the questions you asked about any system. Her father had taught her that too, though he had phrased it differently. The afternoon passed slowly in the particular way that time passes when there is nothing to do and nothing to know, and the uncertainty of the situation is large enough that any movement feels premature. The October sun moved across the high windows, and the angle of the light shifted, and the floor remained hard, and the buckets of water were half empty by 3 in the afternoon. Sergeant Thaddeus Thornton brought 2 additional buckets in at approximately 4 o'clock. He did this without being asked. He set them down near the right wall, said nothing, and returned to his post at the door. 3 of the women nearest the door moved slightly away from him when he entered. Not dramatically, not with any visible alarm, just a small, unconscious adjustment of bodies that are calibrating distance. Constance watched this too. She was also watching Rosamund Quillen, who had been sitting with her back against the far wall since they arrived and who had not changed her position in several hours, which was itself a kind of information. Rosamund Quillen was 31 years old. She had been the head cook at Harrow Creek for 3 years, which meant she had been responsible for feeding 40 men through 2 winters and a summer that had been, by any reasonable measure, catastrophic in terms of heat. She was a practical person who solved problems with the same calm attention that Constance applied to signals, and she had been doing this with her own health for the past 36 hours. She had woken on the morning before the evacuation with a headache and a warmth at the back of her throat that she recognized as the beginning of something, and had decided to manage it through the journey and address it when they arrived somewhere with the resources to address it. That decision had made sense at the time. The journey had been longer and colder than anticipated, and the something had progressed in the way that somethings do when they are not addressed. She was sitting very straight. Her hands were on her knees. She was breathing with a deliberateness that Constance had learned to associate in 2 years of living in close quarters with people in various states of health, with the act of controlling something that would otherwise not be controlled. In the fading afternoon light that came through the high windows, her cheeks carried a flush that was not the color of cold. Constance looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Millicent. Millicent was watching the door. Constance looked back at Rosamund and did the arithmetic. If Rosamund had been running a fever since the previous morning, it had been approximately 20 hours. In 20 hours without adequate water and with significant physical exertion and dropping temperatures, a fever of moderate intensity tends to become a fever of less moderate intensity. This was not medical knowledge in any formal sense. It was the accumulated observation of someone who had lived and worked in remote locations where the nearest doctor was often a day's ride away, and where knowing what you were seeing before it became an emergency was simply a practical skill. She looked at the floor between herself and Rosamund and considered the distance. The evening came without announcement. One of the soldiers lit a lantern and hung it near the door, and its light reached perhaps a third of the length of the room before fading into shadow. The women arranged themselves for sleep as best they could. Someone had a blanket, and someone else had a coat, and these were shared without discussion, according to some logic of proximity and visible need that resolved itself without any formal negotiation. Constance did not sleep immediately. She lay on her side with her eyes open and listened to the sounds of the room, the settling of wood in the cold, the distant sound of horses in the stable yard, and underneath all of it, from the far corner, the sound of Rosamund Quillen breathing. It was not the breathing of sleep. It was the breathing of someone who was managing something in the dark, careful and deliberate, the way you breathe when you are afraid that if you breathe any other way, the thing you are managing will break through the surface. Constance counted the rhythms without meaning to. It was an occupational tendency. Morse code conditions you to hear the pattern in any signal, and breathing, like everything else, has a pattern that tells you something when you learn to read it. Rosamund's pattern said controlled effort, sustained, beginning to cost something. She had not told anyone she was sick. Constance understood this. In the systems they had all operated in before today, illness was a liability. Liability attracted attention. Attention from authority, in most of their experience, was not something you sought out voluntarily, because the authority had limited capacity, and you did not want to consume it on yourself when there were 40 other people whose needs were competing for the same limited resource. You managed what you could manage. You endured what you could not manage. You did not bring your problems to the person above you unless the alternative was worse. That was the framework they had all been living inside for so long that it had stopped feeling like a framework and had started feeling like the nature of things. The question that Constance was asking herself in the dark, listening to Rosamund breathe, was whether that framework was still operative. She did not know. She had no information about what would happen if she went to the guard at the door and told him that one of the women needed medical attention. She had no information about what the response would be, whether it would be helpful or indifferent or something worse, whether the act of drawing attention to a problem would cause the problem to be addressed or would cause some other kind of attention to fall on a person who did not want it. She had some information about one of the soldiers, the one who had brought the extra water without being asked. She had watched him during the afternoon and noted that he moved through the room without the stiffness of someone performing authority for an audience, that he had looked at the buckets when he brought them in and assessed whether they were positioned usefully and adjusted the placement of the second one slightly, a small practical correction that no one had asked him to make. That was the kind of attention that came from a person who was genuinely present in the space rather than simply occupying it. She lay in the dark and listened to Rosamund and thought about the difference between those two things. Outside, the Arizona night had settled into the deep cold that follows desert sunsets, the particular cold of high altitude and dry air that drops faster and harder than the cold of the places most of them had come from. The lantern near the door cast a thin circle of warmth that did not reach the far corner. Sergeant Thaddeus Thornton was 19 hours into a 32-hour stretch of combined duty that had come about through a combination of personnel shortage and administrative miscommunication that no one had bothered to resolve because there were larger miscommunications requiring attention. He was standing near the door with his rifle at rest and his eyes moving at the intervals his training had established. And he was doing what he had been doing for most of the past 4 months, which was performing a function that had been defined for him while trying to understand what the function was actually for. He had grown up in Dayton, Ohio, the third of 5 children, in a house where the primary method of managing conflict was a kind of patient silence in which everyone waited until the thing that was causing the conflict either resolved itself or became large enough that ignoring it was no longer possible. His father worked at the telegraph office on 5th Street and had worked there for 20 years, and Thornton had spent enough time in that office as a child to understand that the people who worked there were part of a system that moved information from one place to another, and that the system worked not because any individual part of it was exceptional, but because the parts were consistent and could be relied upon to do what they were supposed to do when the moment required it. He had joined the Army at 19 because it had seemed like a way out of the textile mill, where his father had arranged for him a position that would have been reliable and respectable and would have consumed his next 40 years in a way that he could not, when he imagined it at length, make himself accept. He had not expected Arizona. He had not expected the particular difficulty of standing guard over people who were not prisoners, but were also not free to go in a facility that had no defined protocol for what they were, in a chain of command that was stretched thin enough that a sergeant could find himself working 17 hours without relief and simply had to manage. He had been managing. He had also been paying attention. He had noticed Rosamund Quillen when the group arrived, not with any particular intention, but because watching people enter a space and reading the room was something he had been doing since he was old enough to enter rooms. Rosamund had caught his attention for the same reason Constance had identified she was managing something. The way she walked, the careful placement of her feet, the slight excess of stillness in her posture, these were not the movements of a healthy person conserving energy. They were the movements of a person spending energy to appear to have more energy than she did. He had considered mentioning it to someone. He had not been sure who to mention it to or in what terms, and the afternoon had been busy with logistics, and he had not known for certain what he was seeing, and the default in situations of uncertainty was to continue the task you had been assigned and report if things became clear. Things had not become clear. They had simply become darker. He was standing at the door at 10:15 when Constance Caldwell stood up from her place on the floor and crossed the room toward him. She walked without hesitation directly the way a person walks when they have already had the argument with themselves and resolved it, and are now simply executing the resolution. She stopped in front of him at a distance that was neither confrontational nor apologetic, and said in a voice that was clear and level, "One of the women in the far corner has had a fever since yesterday morning. I am not asking for anything. I am telling you because you are the person here who can do something about it, and I believe you are the kind of person who will." He was not prepared for the last part of that sentence. It was not how people in her position typically spoke to people in his. He stood for a moment with the words in the air between them and understood several things simultaneously. She had been watching him. She had reached a conclusion about what she saw, and she was betting on that conclusion was something that mattered. He looked past her in the direction of the far wall, in the direction of the corner where the lantern light did not reach, and he followed his own attention to Rosamund Quillen. From across the room in the available light, he could see the color on her face. He had seen that color before. He knew what it meant. He stood for a moment looking at her. Then he looked back at Constance. She had not moved. She was watching him with the focused patience of someone who has sent a message and is waiting to see whether it arrives. He turned and said a few words to Private Ashworth, who had appeared at his shoulder with the timing of someone who had been watching the exchange from a few feet away with the small notebook he carried always somewhere on his person. Then Thornton walked out of the building. Constance returned to her place on the floor. She did not know what she had set in motion. She knew only that she had sent the message. The rest was not hers to control. Millicent was awake. She had been awake. Constance suspected for most of the night. She looked at Constance from across the room with an expression that was not easy to read, and what she said was only, "I hope that was not a mistake." Constance said, "I don't know." This was the truest thing she could have said, and Millicent appeared to recognize it as such because she said nothing further and lay back down and closed her eyes. Ashworth, standing outside the door in the cold with his notebook open in his hand, wrote the time in the margin, 10:23. Then he wrote Thornton's name. Then he stood in the dark and waited to see what happened next, because whatever was happening struck him, even at 19, as something that someone ought to be keeping a record of. He had been thinking this since they arrived. He thought it about a lot of things. It was in some ways that he had not yet found language for the reason he had learned to keep the notebook in the first place. Inside the building, Rosamund Quillen was breathing in the dark. The night was very cold and very quiet, and somewhere across the compound, a horse shifted in its stall and the lantern near the door moved slightly in a draft from under the threshold. And the circle of light it cast moved with it, reaching briefly toward the far corner before contracting back. Then footsteps outside, then the sound of the door opening. And Thornton had not come back alone. Behind Thornton came a man in a different uniform. Not cavalry, not infantry. The coat was the same olive drab, but the collar carried a small brass insignia that none of the women recognized in the low light. And the bag the man carried made a faint sound of metal against metal as he walked, and those two things together told Constance what she needed to know before he had crossed half the distance of the room. Dr. Yancey Ingram was 45 years old and had been practicing military medicine for 18 of them, which meant he had seen illness in conditions that had no right to produce survival and had developed over those years a particular economy of movement. He did not look around the room when he entered. He walked directly to the far corner where Rosamund was sitting, set his bag down, and crouched in front of her with the unhurried precision of a man who had already decided what he was going to do before he came through the door. Rosamund looked at him. She had the expression of someone who has been managing a secret for long enough that the sudden visibility of it produces not relief, but a complicated discomfort, the feeling of being seen when you had worked very hard not to be. He did not speak. He placed the back of his hand against her forehead, held it there for 3 seconds, removed it, checked her pulse at the wrist, looked at her eyes, pressed 2 fingers gently along the line of her jaw, opened his bag. The room had gone completely quiet. 17 women watching a man they had never seen before perform a series of actions that none of them had asked for in the middle of the night, in a building that had been a storage room until a week ago. Constance watched from her position by the window. She watched Ingram, and she watched the room watching Ingram, and she noticed specifically that Millicent had not looked away from the far corner since he entered. Millicent, who had spent the better part of the evening telling people with her posture and her silence that the correct approach to their situation was stillness and invisibility, was watching a man provide medical care to one of their group with an expression that Constance could not name precisely, but that contained something she had not seen in Millicent's face before. It was not surprise. It was something more careful than surprise. Ingram produced 2 aspirin tablets from a paper envelope and a canteen of water. He held up 2 fingers, pointed at the tablets, mimed the act of swallowing with a single economical gesture. Rosamond looked at the tablets in her palm for a moment, then at him, then swallowed them with water from his canteen. He watched to confirm it. Then he stood up and looked at the room. It was a professional survey, the kind that moves quickly and lands specifically, and it lasted perhaps 4 seconds. He said something to Thornton in a low voice. Thornton nodded. Then Ingram picked up his bag and walked out of the building without another word. Thornton remained at the door. He looked at Constance, once a brief and direct look that was neither warm nor cold, just the look of a person confirming that a transaction has been completed. And then he took his position again and was still. The room returned to itself slowly, not to what it had been before, but to something that occupied the same surface while something underneath it had shifted. Rosamond held the empty paper envelope in her right hand and looked at it. She had taken aspirin before. She knew what aspirin was and what it did and how long it would take to work. None of that was what she was thinking about. She was thinking about the sequence. Someone had noticed. Someone had gone to find help. Help had arrived. Nothing had been demanded of her in return. No accounting had been requested, no debt established, no condition placed on the assistance. In the system she had worked inside for 11 years of adult life, this sequence did not occur. Help was not an uncomplicated thing. It arrived with obligation attached, or it arrived late, or it arrived in a form that created as many problems as it solved. The idea that a man she had never seen before would walk across a cold room in the middle of the night and place aspirin in her hands and ask for nothing was so far outside the structure of what she expected that it did not register immediately as kindness. It registered as an anomaly, something that required explanation. She was still trying to find the explanation when she fell asleep. Constance did not sleep. She lay in the dark with her eyes open and listened to Rosamond's breathing change the careful, controlled rhythm, loosening into something more natural as the aspirin began to work and the effort of management could be reduced slightly. It was a small change. Constance noticed it the way she noticed small changes in signal quality on the wire, not because she was looking for it, but because she was listening, and listening was what she did. Millicent was awake too. Constance could tell by the quality of her stillness, the kind of stillness that is maintained rather than natural. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The lantern near the door had burned lower, and the circle of light it cast had contracted to perhaps 6 feet in diameter, and the room beyond that circle existed in a darkness that was not complete, but was deep enough that faces were shapes rather than expressions. Then Millicent said quietly enough that only Constance would hear she had not expected that. Constance said no. Millicent was silent for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had a different texture, something that had been removed from it that Constance had not noticed was there until it was gone. She said that she had been at Copper Ridge in 1882. She had told Constance about a woman named Margaret and the 11 days of detention in the chain of bureaucratic escalation that no one had known how to stop. What she had not said before, what she said now in the dark, was that she had witnessed the beginning of that situation and had not spoken up when she might have. She had calculated the risk the same way she always calculated risk invisibility as protection, and she had been silent, and Margaret had spent 11 days in a room waiting for a process to resolve that might have been shorter if someone had intervened earlier. She had been telling herself since that morning that her caution was wisdom accumulated from experience. She had been telling herself that Constance's instinct to act was the instinct of someone who had not yet learned what experience teaches. She said, "I built my rule from a story I didn't see the end of." Constance said nothing. There was nothing useful to add to that. Millicent had arrived at the conclusion herself in the dark, in the middle of the night, which was the only way conclusions of that kind arrive with any weight. Saying "yes, you're right" would have diminished it. She let it stand. Millicent did not say anything else. After a while, her breathing changed too, not into sleep, but into something more settled than it had been. Constance looked at the ceiling, at the faint play of lantern light across the wooden beams, and thought about frameworks and what it cost to maintain them after the evidence had begun to turn. She did not have an answer. She had a data point. One data point was not enough to revise a framework. It was enough to create a question. The morning came the way Arizona mornings came in October, fast and pale, the light arriving through the high windows before the warmth did so, that the room was bright and cold simultaneously, and everyone woke into a chill that the night had not quite prepared them for. Constance was already sitting up. She had been sitting up since 5. Rosamond Quillen's color was better. The aspirin had done what aspirin does, and the fever had reduced to something manageable, which was not the same as resolved. Constance could see the improvement and also see the limitation of it. The underlying condition had not changed. The surface had been treated. This would hold for some hours, and then the fever would begin to climb again unless something more substantial was done. She thought about this while the room woke around her. She thought about what she knew and what she did not know. She knew the medical situation was not resolved. She did not know the procedure for requesting further medical assistance. She did not know whether the act of making such a request would produce the assistance or produce a different kind of attention. She knew that Thornton had acted on her report the previous night with a directness and a speed that she had not anticipated. She did not know whether that reflected his character or the policy of the fort or some temporary convergence of circumstances that would not repeat. There was only one way to find out, and she was aware of it. Millicent was watching her from across the room. Constance looked at her. Millicent looked back. In the morning light, her face was readable in a way it had not been the night before. And what Constance read there was something that was not quite permission and not quite warning, but existed somewhere between the two. The expression of a person who has revised their position, but is not yet certain the revision was correct, and is watching to see what the evidence produces next. Constance stood up. She walked to Thornton's position at the door. He had been replaced during the night by a soldier named Grover, a man whose attention moved over the surface of situations without penetrating them, and Constance had made a note of this distinction the previous afternoon. But Thornton was back now, standing with the same attentive quality he had brought to the night before, and he looked at her when she approached with the same direct and undemanding attention. She said that Rosamond's fever had come down but would come back. She said the aspirin had helped, and more would help, but would not be enough. She said this clearly and without embellishment, reporting the situation as she understood it, and she watched his face while she said it. He nodded once, turned to Ashworth, who was nearby as always, and said something brief. Ashworth said something back. Then Thornton said, "Wait here." He walked out. Constance returned to her position and sat down. The room watched her without appearing to watch her, the sideways attention of people in a confined space who have learned to gather information without directing it. Millicent said nothing. Rosamond, who had heard the exchange from the corner, was looking at Constance with an expression she could not entirely read, something between gratitude and a guilt that had no clear object. Constance said, "To no one in particular, we'll see." They waited. 40 minutes passed. The light through the windows climbed higher as the sun cleared the canyon wall to the east, and the cold in the room began to ease slightly, and Keturah Fairchild braided her hair, and someone else found a piece of hardtack in a coat pocket and broke it carefully into portions, smaller than any of them needed, but larger than none. These small acts of routine were not comfort exactly, but they were the things that hands did when they needed something to do, and the thing they needed was not available. Then the door opened. Thornton had not come alone. Ingram was with him again, bag over one shoulder, and behind Ingram was a third man that none of them had seen before, older, heavier, moving with the specific gravity of a person accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. Constance had never seen this man and did not know his rank, but knew from the way Ingram moved slightly aside to give him the doorway first, and then moved forward again without deferring further, that whatever their relative positions in the formal structure, the informal one was more complicated. Ingram went directly to Rosamond. The older man stood near the door and looked at the room with a professional survey, counting, assessing, noting. Constance watched him do it and noted that he did not appear troubled by what he saw, but also did not appear indifferent to it. Ingram examined Rosamond more thoroughly than the night before. He was looking for something specific, and he found it. Constance could tell by the way his hands paused briefly over her chest when he listened the fraction of a second longer than the examination required, the small recalibration of a person who has found something unexpected. He stood up and spoke to the older man in a low voice. The older man listened and then asked one question. Ingram answered. The older man nodded and left. Ingram turned to Thornton and said something that included Constance was nearly certain a specific supply request because Thornton wrote something on a small piece of paper and put it in his breast pocket. Then Ingram looked at the room again, this time not as an administrator but as a doctor. And what he did next was something that none of them had expected. He did not leave. He moved to Keturah Fairchild and looked at her hands. Keturah had been holding her right hand slightly away from her body since the previous afternoon, a small protective gesture she had probably stopped consciously noticing hours ago. Ingram looked at the palm. The wound was not large, but it was infected, and had been for at least 2 days. He cleaned it with something from his bag and wrapped it with a strip of clean bandage and tied it without comment. He moved to Beulah Vickers 35, who had been limping since they arrived. He crouched down and looked at her boots. He unlaced the right one carefully and found what was underneath, which was not good, and he addressed it with the same methodical attention he had given everything else, and when he was finished, he laced the boot back up and moved on. He did not speak during any of this. He did not explain what he was doing or why. He did not perform generosity or make any gesture that required the women to receive it as anything other than what it was, which was a man doing the work he was trained to do in the place where it needed to be done. Thornton stood near the door and watched. Ashworth stood further back near the window and wrote in his notebook. He had stopped pretending he was not writing in it. No one had told him to stop. Constance sat against the wall and felt something she had not expected to feel, which was not gratitude, not yet, and not trust, not that either. What she felt was the specific disorientation of a person whose internal map no longer matches the territory. She had a map. It had been built from 2 years in Arizona and 11 years of watching how systems treated the people at the bottom of them. And it was a good map, carefully constructed, accurate to everything she had observed. And it was not matching what she was seeing. The problem with a map that stops matching the territory is that you cannot simply discard it. You have built your movements around it. Your decisions have been calibrated to it. You cannot look at 3 days of contradictory evidence and conclude that everything you knew was wrong. But you can notice the discrepancy. You can hold it without resolving it and continue moving forward and look for more data. She was looking. Then the door opened in a different way. Not Ingram entering, not Thornton. Lieutenant Leander Hartwell came through the door in the early afternoon of the second day with a different energy than anything Constance had seen in the building before, the energy of a man who had been told something he considered relevant and had decided to respond to it immediately. He was 34 years old and had the bearing of a person who had organized his identity around competence and had therefore developed a particular sensitivity to anything that suggested the organization was not working. He looked at Ingram, who was finishing with a final examination near the back of the room, and he said something quiet and pointed that Constance could not hear from her position. Ingram looked at him with the expression of a man who has heard something he disagrees with and is deciding whether to say so. What followed was not a quiet exchange. Ingram said in a voice that was low but not inaudible, "I do not interrupt my examinations, Lieutenant." Hartwell said that the schedule for the holding facility did not include extended medical rounds. Ingram said that the schedule for the holding facility did not include a great many things it should have included, and that this was a conversation they could have when he had finished, not before. Hartwell's jaw set. He was a man accustomed to deference from men of lower rank, and Ingram was of lower rank, and the absence of deference had produced in him the expression of a person confronting an unexpected obstacle in a corridor they had expected to be clear. Ingram said with a finality that closed the subject, "The medical care of persons in military custody is not discretionary, sir. I will be finished in 10 minutes. He returned to what he was doing. Hartwell stood near the door for those 10 minutes. He did not speak. He did not leave. He waited in the way that men of authority wait when they have been publicly checked and are deciding what their response will cost them. When Ingram finished and closed his bag and walked toward the door, Hartwell said something to him in a voice low enough that only Ingram could hear. Ingram listened. Then he said one more thing, also low, and walked out. Hartwell looked at the room. His eyes moved over the women assembled there and settled with what appeared to Constance to be inevitability on her. He told her to come with him. She stood and went. The room she was taken to was a small office near the command building, a desk and 2 chairs, and a window that faced the western wall. Hartwell sat behind the desk. She sat in the chair across from it. On the desk was a pad of paper and a pen. He had not brought anyone to write, which told her this was preliminary. He asked about the telegraph operations at Harrow Creek. He phrased the questions as routine intake questions, the kind of thing done for every person in her situation. She listened to the phrasing and heard what was inside it because she had spent 2 years receiving messages that said one thing and meant another, and the skill transferred without difficulty. He was not asking about routine telegraph operations. He was asking about the 6 weeks before the evacuation, about the content and frequency of specific transmissions, about whether she had received or sent anything that fell outside the normal pattern of supply requests and production updates. She answered each question with the truth because the truth was all she had, and because she was intelligent enough to know that in a conversation with someone who had access to the actual transmission records, any deviation from the truth was a gamble, with odds she could not calculate. She described the traffic at Harrow Creek accurately. She described the verification protocols that the office used to identify unauthorized use of the line, a system of coded checks built into the transmission headers that flag signals originating from outside the registered equipment. She explained this carefully and specifically because it was directly relevant to his questions and because understanding it would allow him to understand the answer. She watched his face change while she explained it. It changed in a way she had not anticipated. She had expected the explanation to function as exculpatory, the demonstration of knowledge that would clarify rather than complicate. What she saw instead was a small but unmistakable recalibration, the expression of a man who has received information that does not fit the category he was applying and is deciding how to handle the misfit. He knew the line had been used for unauthorized transmissions in the weeks before the evacuation. She had just told him correctly that she would have known about it because the verification system she ran would have flagged it. What he appeared to be hearing, she realized, was not that she had detected and prevented unauthorized use. What he appeared to be hearing was that she had access to a system sensitive enough to detect it and therefore had been in a position to either prevent it or facilitate it. The knowledge that she possessed, presented as evidence of her professionalism, was being read as evidence of her proximity to something he had already decided to investigate. She sat in the chair and felt the ground of the conversation shift beneath her, very quietly in a way that left no surface indication. She was no longer in the category of displaced civilian. She did not know what category she was in. He said he would need to send an inquiry to the central office in Tucson to verify the records. He said it would take time. He said she should make herself comfortable in the holding facility in the interim. She said how long? He said he couldn't be certain. She nodded and stood up. She was at the door when she thought of the question and stopped, not because she had been planning to ask it, because Millicent's face in the dark the previous night had stayed with her, and the question presented itself with a clarity that cut through the calculation she would otherwise have applied to the decision of whether to ask it. She said, "Is anyone notifying the families of the women being held here?" He looked at her. The question clearly had no home in any of the procedures he was currently running. No file it fit into, no line on the form it corresponded to. She could see him realize this not as a failure on his part, but as a gap he had not considered, which was its own kind of information about the gap. He said he would look into it. She walked back to the warehouse in the afternoon light and went through the door and past Thornton at his post without looking at him, and crossed the room to her place by the window and sat down. Millicent was watching her. Constance looked back. She said they are checking the telegraph records in Tucson. It will take time. Millicent said how much time. Constance said he didn't say. There was a silence. Then Millicent said, and the question about the families. Constance said he would look into it. Millicent was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You asked him." Constance said yes. Millicent said nothing further. She looked at her hands in her lap and then at the room around them, the women sitting on the hard floor in the afternoon light, the makeshift arrangements of coats and bundled clothing that had accumulated over 2 days, the small economies of space and warmth that had been worked out by a group of people with nothing to negotiate except the terms of their discomfort. She looked at all of it, and then she looked back at Constance with an expression that Constance filed alongside the one from the night before, adding it to the small collection of data points she was building about what it looked like when a person's framework was being revised against their will. She did not say anything about it. Neither did Millicent. The afternoon moved toward evening in the slow way it had the day before, but different now in texture, the silence of the room less opaque, the space between people slightly more permeable. Keturah Fairchild, whose hand had been wrapped that morning, found a way to sit near Rosamond Quillen without making it obvious she had chosen to. Rosamond, whose color remained better than it had been, but whose energy was clearly still limited, allowed the proximity without comment. Small things, things that would not have been visible to anyone looking at the room from outside, things that were visible from inside it. Thornton came on duty at 4 in the afternoon. The women who had been timing their movements to his schedule, a pattern that Constance had begun to notice the previous day, confirmed itself. Almira Kingsley, who had said nothing to any soldiers since their arrival, waited until Thornton was at his position, and then walked to him and turned her right foot slightly outward and said nothing, simply stood there. He looked at her boot. He said a word to Ashworth. The process began. Ashworth, watching Almira walk back to her place, opened his notebook and wrote something. Constance, watching Ashworth, could not see what he wrote. She suspected it was something specific and small, and likely to matter to someone later. She was right about that. She would not know she was right about it for 5 years. The evening came, and with it, a cold that had more edge than the nights before, the kind of cold that finds the gaps in clothing and settles there with patient malice. By 8 in the evening, Rosamond was sitting straight, again the controlled posture, the careful breath. The aspirin from the previous night was hours ago. The fever would be building again. Constance stood up. Millicent looked up from across the room. This time she said nothing. She simply looked, and in the look was something that had not been there the first night. Not permission exactly, and not support, but the specific quality of attention that belongs to a person who has decided to watch rather than intervene. Constance crossed the room. Before she could reach the door, it opened from the outside. Thornton stood there. Behind him was Ingram. Behind Ingram was the older man again, and this time he was carrying something that Ingram was not, a smaller case that clinked differently than the medical bag, the sound of glass vials in a padded container. Ingram looked at Constance. He stopped for a moment in the doorway and looked at her with the diagnostic attention he gave everything, and then he walked past her into the room without comment, moving toward Rosamond in the corner, and the older man followed him. And Thornton stayed at the door, and Constance stood in the middle of the room and understood that something she had set in motion the night before had traveled somewhere she had not seen, and had come back in the form of a glass vial in a padded case, which was a form of answer to a question she had not known how to ask. She turned to look at Thornton. He was watching Ingram work. His face had the expression of a man watching something he has done participate in an outcome, the specific attention of someone tracing the line between action and consequence, and finding it intact. He did not look at Constance. He did not need to. But Ashworth looked at her. He was standing near the wall with his notebook open, and he looked at her with the well-known careful attention of 19, at which you can still see things clearly because you have not yet learned to look away from them. And what he saw on her face, he wrote down later that night in the margin of his notebook in handwriting too small for anyone passing to read. He wrote she was not surprised. She was something else. He did not write what the something else was because he was 19 and did not have the word for it yet. The word was recognition. The specific disorienting recognition of someone who has acted on incomplete information and watched the outcome arrive and found, to their considerable confusion, that it matched what they had hoped rather than what they had feared. She stood in the room and watched Ingram work and held that recognition carefully, the way you hold something you have not had in your hands before and are not yet sure how to carry. On the 7th morning, Constance woke before the others and lay still for a moment, eyes open, cataloging the room by sound before she looked at it. What she heard was different, not dramatically, not in any way that would have registered to someone who had arrived that morning without the previous 6 days of context. But she had the previous 6 days, and what she heard in the breathing of the room was the difference between people sleeping because exhaustion required it and people sleeping because sleep had become, for the first time since they arrived, something their bodies were willing to permit without a fight. She sat up and looked at the room in the early light. Rosamond Quillen was asleep on her side, which she had not been able to do on any of the previous nights. The controlled, upright posture was gone. Her face was relaxed, and her color was steady, and her breathing moved in and out without the effortful quality that Constance had been tracking for 6 days, always listening for the thing beneath the thing. The sulfate quinine had arrived the previous evening in the padded case that clinked. Ingram had administered the first dose himself and left the remainder with instructions that Thornton relayed to Constance through the simple method of handing her a piece of paper on which Ingram had drawn a clock face with 2 times marked. She had understood it without needing translation. She had given Rosamond the second dose at midnight while everyone else slept. She was still holding the paper. She folded it once and put it in her coat pocket and got up and went to the low window and looked out at the compound in the gray light before sunrise. A soldier she did not recognize was crossing the yard with his collar up against the cold. A horse was being led from the stable toward the eastern gate. The flag above the command building was straight in the wind, the kind of wind that comes before dawn and dies when the sun clears the ridge. Fort Bowie on the 7th day looked exactly as it had on the 1st. The buildings were the same. The wall was the same. The soldiers moved through the same patterns they had always moved through. Nothing in the physical structure of the place had changed at all. She was aware, standing at the window, that she was not the same person who had stood in the telegraph shack at Harrow Creek a week and a half ago and sent a message into silence and waited to see if anyone received it. She could not have said precisely what the difference was. It was not confidence. It was not the absence of fear. It was something more like the adjustment that occurs when you have been carrying a weight at the wrong angle for a long time, and someone shows you a different way to hold it, and the weight is exactly the same, but the effort required is different, and your body has to relearn what it thought it knew. She was still relearning. The morning proceeded. Ingram arrived at his now established time earlier than Hartwell's schedule would have dictated and without requesting permission from anyone, and moved through the room with his bag. He had examined Keturah Fairchild's hand twice since the initial treatment, and the infection was clearing. He had checked on Beulah Vickers' foot each day. He checked on Odessa Dunmore, whose chest had concerned him and who was responding to the treatment with the slow, stubborn progress of a person whose body was doing the work but not rushing it. He did not speak to Constance during any of this. He had not spoken to her directly since the examination of Rosamond on the second morning. This was not coldness. It was simply that he had no medical reason to speak to her, and he did not manufacture reasons for conversation that did not exist. She respected this. It was the same principle she applied to telegraph traffic. You sent what needed sending, and you did not fill the wire with noise. What she noticed was that he had stopped looking at the room with the survey he had used on the first visit. He looked at it differently now, not as a space containing an undifferentiated group requiring management, but as a space containing specific people whose specific conditions he was tracking. He knew which woman slept near the right wall and which one had moved to the center after the third night and why. He knew that Elmira Kingsley favored her left side when she stood. He knew that the woman who had said the least since they arrived, a quiet person named Imogene Osborne, who was 43 and had worked as an assayer at one of the smaller claims, was the one most likely to be awake when he entered, regardless of the hour. He had learned the room. He had not been told to. He had simply been in it enough times with enough attention that the room had become specific to him in the way that rooms become specific when you have cared about what happens in them. Constance watched him leave on the 7th morning and thought about the word care and what it did and did not mean when applied to a man who would have described his own motivation as professional obligation. She did not resolve this question. She put it with the others she was accumulating and turned to the problem of the day. The problem of the day was Hartwell. He appeared at 10 without Ingram, without any of the ancillary presence that had accompanied his previous visits, and he came directly to Constance and said with the efficiency of a man closing a file, the inquiry to Tucson had been completed. The telegraph records had been reviewed. There was nothing in them that required further investigation. She waited. He said nothing further. She understood that he was telling her she was cleared and that he was telling her in the language available to a man who does not say I was wrong, but can say the investigation is complete. These were not the same thing. She had learned a long time ago that they were as close as certain kinds of people could get to the same thing, and that requiring them to get closer was a way of ensuring you received nothing at all. She said, "Thank you." He nodded. Then, with the careful neutrality of a man raising a subject he has been avoiding, the matter of family notification was being handled. A messenger had been dispatched to Phoenix with a list of names 2 days ago. Responses were beginning to arrive. She had not known this. He had told no one. He had simply done it or had caused it to be done in the quiet between the things that were being officially managed, and he was telling her now because she had asked and because the asking had apparently lodged somewhere in him that required acknowledgement. She said, "I appreciate that." He nodded again and left. She stood in the center of the room for a moment. Millicent was watching her from across the space had been watching since Hartwell appeared, and when Constance met her eyes, she asked the question without words. Constance said they sent a messenger to Phoenix. Millicent went very still. Then she said, when? Constance said 2 days ago. Millicent looked at her hands. She was not a woman who showed feeling quickly or easily, and what crossed her face in the following seconds was visible precisely because it was involuntary, the arrival of something she had not permitted herself to expect, and was therefore not defended against. She pressed her lips together once, looked at the ceiling, then looked back at Constance with an expression that had reorganized itself into something more controlled, though the edges of it were still unsteady. She said, you asked him that the first day. Constance said yes. Millicent said, when you came back from the interview. Constance said yes. Millicent was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the room went on with its business, the small mid-morning activities of women who had been living in close quarters long enough to have developed routines and were carrying out those routines in the way that people carry out routines when the underlying situation is uncertain, and routine is one of the few things that feels like ground. Millicent said, I wouldn't have thought to ask that. Constance said, you might have. Millicent looked at her with the direct expression she had used for their first silent assessment on the day of arrival, the look that took stock rather than performed. She said, no. I would have been thinking about the things that could go wrong with asking. I wouldn't have gotten to the thing that could go right. This was an honest statement, and it cost something to make. Constance received it as such and did not soften it or argue with it. She said, you told me about Copper Ridge. I knew there were families who needed to know. Millicent said, that's not the same as asking. Constance said no. They looked at each other. It was the plainest exchange they had had without strategy on either side. Two people arriving at the same ground from different directions and standing on it together for the first time. Then Millicent said, with the return of her characteristic precision, how much longer do you think they'll keep us here? Constance said, not long. They want us somewhere else. We take up resources and generate paperwork, and neither of those things is convenient. Millicent made a sound that might in another context have been a laugh. The afternoon brought the letter. Hartwell carried it himself, which Constance noted as unusual, and he stood at the door and called Millicent's name. And when she stood, he crossed the room and handed the envelope to her without ceremony or explanation, and left. Millicent held it in both hands and looked at it and did not open it for nearly a minute, during which the room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something important is happening, and everyone can feel it, but no one wants to intrude on it. She opened it. She read it. She folded it again with the careful movements of someone managing something that they do not want to drop. Then she sat down in the center of the room in the place where she always sat, and she put her face in her hands for a moment. Not crying, or not only that, something more like the release of a pressure that had been held so long, the body did not know immediately what to do with the space the pressure had occupied. Constance did not go to her. She did not think Millicent wanted that. She watched from across the room and let the moment be what it was, which was private, which was Millicent's, which did not require anything from anyone else. After a while, Millicent lifted her face and looked across the room at Constance and placed her hand flat on her own chest briefly, the kind of gesture that means something without having a name. Constance nodded. That was all. It was enough. Thornton saw it from the door. He had been watching, and he saw Millicent read the letter and fold it, and he saw the gesture, and he saw Constance's response, and he did not write any of it down because he was not Ashworth and did not keep a notebook. But he remembered it for a long time. He would think about it years later and still not have better language for what it had been than two people on the same side of something, finally. On the 9th day, Rosamond Quillen spoke to Ingram. He was finishing with Keturah Fairchild's hand the final examination, declaring the infection resolved with the same economy he brought to everything, and Rosamond was sitting close enough to have watched the whole process. When Ingram began to close his bag, she said, "Do you need more bandage?" He looked at her. She said she had a length of bandage left from what he had given her, that she had used only part of it, and the rest was clean, and if it was useful, she had it. He held out his hand. She produced the rolled bandage from her coat pocket and gave it to him. He put it in his bag. He said, "Thank you." She said, "Of course." He closed his bag and stood and left. It was a 30-second exchange about a strip of bandage. Constance, who had seen it from across the room, understood what it was. Rosamond had spent 9 days receiving. She had just spent 30 seconds giving. The transaction was minor. The shift it represented was not. It was the moment Rosamund Quillen stopped being a patient in her own mind and became a person in a situation which was a different thing entirely, and which was irreversible once it occurred. Constance thought one data point is not enough. 3 is a pattern, 9 days is something more than a pattern. She still did not have a name for it. She was beginning to think the name was less important than the fact. On the 11th morning, Thornton came on duty, and instead of taking his position at the door, he crossed the room directly to Constance. This was the first time he had initiated contact. She stood up automatically. He said in the careful way of a person delivering information he has verified and wants to deliver accurately, "Lieutenant Hartwell asked me to tell you that the group will be transferred to Wilcox on the 14th. Civilian accommodations. You'll be free to make your own arrangements from there." She said 3 days. He said yes. She said all of us. He said all of you. She nodded. He nodded back. He started to return to the door and then stopped, which was unusual enough that she waited to see what followed. He said without turning fully around, "Ingram is going to check on Odessa Dunmore again this afternoon. He wanted me to tell you in case she had questions." Constance said, "I'll let her know." He returned to the door. She stood in the middle of the room with 3 days in her hands and thought about what 3 days meant. It meant the situation had an end. It meant the end was near enough to see. It also meant that she had been in this room for 11 days under conditions that had not been what she expected them to be, which was a fact she had been accumulating evidence for, but had not yet stated to herself in those terms. She stated it now. The conditions had not been what she expected. She had expected, if not cruelty, then indifference in the specific form that indifference takes when it is systemic, the indifference of a process that processes and nothing more. What she had received was not warmth. It was not friendship. It was not any of the things that people in comfortable circumstances call kindness when they were thinking about human relations in the abstract. What she had received was something more durable and more difficult to dismiss. She had received response. She had acted, and the action had produced a result. She had identified a problem, and the problem had been addressed. The address had been imperfect and slow, and had required navigation, and had involved a man named Hartwell, who had initially been more interested in her as a risk than as a person, and it had still worked. The framework she had built over 22 years was not wrong. The world it described was real. Systems were indifferent. Authority had priorities. Resources were distributed according to logics that did not always include the people most in need of them. All of that remained true. And something else was also true, which was the complication. She was still working on the complication when Millicent came and sat beside her, not in her usual central position, but in the space next to the wall where Constance generally sat, choosing proximity over dominance for the first time since they arrived. Millicent said, "Thornton told you something." Constance said, 3 days. Wilcox. Millicent said, "Good." Then in a different register, "I've been thinking about what I said, about not standing up, about building a rule from an incomplete story." Constance waited. Millicent said, "I'm not saying I was wrong to be careful. I was careful for reasons that were real. I'm saying I didn't account for the possibility that the reasons might not apply everywhere. I treated my experience like it was the whole territory." Constance said, "So did I in the other direction." Millicent looked at her. Constance said, "I decided Thornton was trustworthy based on one observation. A man bringing extra water. That's not much." Millicent said, "And yet." Constance said, "And yet." Millicent said, "So we were both working with incomplete information." Constance said, "Everyone always is." Millicent was quiet for a moment. Then she said with the dry precision that was her natural register, "That's not particularly comforting." Constance said, "No, but it's accurate. And accurate is more useful than comforting." Millicent looked at her sidelong. She said, "Your father teach you that?" Constance said, "He taught me to value the signal over the noise. I worked out the rest." Millicent made the sound again, the one that might have been a laugh. This time it clearly was. On the 13th day, the last full day before the transfer, Ashworth appeared at the door in the early afternoon during a stretch when neither Thornton nor Grover was on duty, and Ashworth himself was apparently there voluntarily, which he sometimes was checking on things in the manner of a person who monitors situations, not because he is required to, but because he cannot stop himself. He stood at the door for a moment. Then he came into the room and crossed to Constance and stood in front of her with the slightly awkward posture of someone who has decided to do something and is in the process of doing it before he loses his nerve. He held out a piece of paper, not a form, a page torn from a notebook, the edges slightly ragged, folded once. She took it and opened it. 2 lines, a date and a time, October 23rd, 10:23 in the morning. And below that, one word, Thornton. She looked up at him. He said, I thought someone should have a record. She said, why me? He said, because you were the reason for the date and time. She looked at the paper again. The handwriting was careful, the handwriting of someone who takes care with records because he believes records matter, that the small specific facts of what happened and when and who was present are not administrative artifacts, but the actual tissue of events that would otherwise be lost. She said, you've been keeping notes since we arrived. He said, since before you arrived. Since I got here. She said, why? He thought about this for a moment, in the earnest way of someone for whom the question had an answer he had not fully articulated before. He said, because things happen and then people say they didn't, or they say they happened differently, and I think the accurate version matters. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket with the clock face instructions Ingram had drawn. 2 pieces of paper that told between them most of what had happened in this room. She said, you should keep writing. He said, I plan to. He went back to the door. She watched him go and thought about him 19 years old with his notebook standing in a cold storage room in Arizona Territory, writing down the date and time of a decision made by a 20-year-old sergeant from Ohio that no one had ordered him to make. Thought about what it meant that someone was writing it down. Thought about the difference between things that were witnessed and things that were not, and how much of what determined the shape of the world fell into one category or the other based on nothing more than whether someone happened to be paying attention. That evening, Thornton was at the door at the end of his shift, and Constance was near the window when she became aware that he had not left. His replacement had arrived and taken the position at the door, but Thornton was still in the room, which was irregular. She looked at him. He was looking at the floor near the door with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is executing it with the same slightly uncomfortable determination that Ashworth had shown earlier. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a piece of paper, smaller than what Ashworth had given her, and he crossed the room to where she was standing and held it out. She took it. An address. Dayton, Ohio, a name, the telegraph office on 5th Street. She looked at him. He said, with the economy of someone who has reduced what he wanted to say to its functional minimum, my father works there. If you ever need to send a message. She said nothing for a moment. She looked at the address and then at him and understood that this was not a complicated gesture. He was not offering friendship or making a declaration of any kind. He was doing the thing that was natural to someone whose frame of reference for connection was a telegraph office. He was giving her a point of contact, a place where a signal could be sent and would be received by someone who knew how to receive it. She said thank you. He nodded once and left. She held the paper in her hand and looked at it for a long time. The next morning, they loaded into 2 wagons before 7 and left Fort Bowie as the sun was clearing the eastern ridge, the same iron-gray light that had been there when they arrived, the territory unchanged and indifferent in the way that territory is not hostile, not welcoming, simply itself. Constance sat in the first wagon near the front. Millicent sat beside her. Rosamond was in the second wagon, sitting up without the controlled effort it had required 11 days ago, able simply to sit, which was its own kind of evidence. As the wagon moved through the south gate, Constance looked back once at the building near the eastern wall. The door was closed. The high windows reflected the morning sky. Ashworth was somewhere inside the fort with his notebook, and Ingram was somewhere preparing for a day that did not include this particular room. And Hartwell was somewhere working through whatever the next problem in his stack of problems was. She turned back and looked at the road ahead. Millicent said without preamble, "What will you do in Wilcox?" Constance said, "Send a telegram to Cincinnati. My father will want to know I'm all right." Millicent said, and after that, Constance said, "Fine work. There are lines going in all the way to New Mexico. They need operators." Millicent said Arizona again. Constance said probably. Millicent looked at the road. She said, "My son will think I should come home to Phoenix." Constance said, "And will you?" Millicent said, "For a while. Then we'll see." This was Constance, understood Millicent at her most expansive. She did not push it further. They rode in the pale morning light through terrain that looked like nothing and contained, as such terrain always does, everything. Constance thought about the address in her coat pocket, the one from Thornton and the one from Ashworth. 2 pieces of paper, 3 if she counted the clock face Ingram had drawn, the simple, wordless instruction that had gotten Rosamond through the night. She thought about what they represented collectively. Not kindness, or not only that, not policy, or not primarily that, though policy had been part of it, the Army regulations and the accountability structures that Ingram had invoked, with the confidence of a man who had tested them and found them real. Not any single thing, but the accumulation of many small things that had occurred when she had acted on incomplete information, and the action had been received by people willing to respond to it. She had spent the past 11 days waiting for the framework to reassert itself, waiting for the moment when the response would fail to come, or would come with conditions, or would come too late, or would come in a form that created new problems. These were not paranoid expectations. They were statistically reasonable expectations based on her prior experience of how systems handled people at their margins. The moment had not come. The framework had not reasserted itself. She was not ready to conclude that the framework was wrong. She was ready to conclude that it was incomplete. This was a smaller conclusion than she might have hoped for, and larger than she had expected to reach. She held it carefully and looked at the road moving under the wagon wheels, and thought about what you do with a conclusion that does not resolve anything but changes what the questions are. The answer was the same answer her father had given her when she was 12 years old, and had asked him how you knew when a signal was real and not interference. He had said, "You don't always know. You send back anyway, and then you listen." She had been sending back. She had been listening. The signal had come. Years later, in the late autumn of 1901, a man named Professor Zebediah Brentwood of the University of Denver was conducting interviews for a study of women who had worked in the American West between 1870 and 1895. He was a careful researcher who had learned that the most useful interviews were the ones where he said the least and the subject said the most, and he had developed the habit of ending his questions before he reached the end of them, leaving space for the person across from him to fill the silence with whatever they actually thought rather than whatever the completed question directed them toward. Constance Caldwell was 39 years old. She managed the telegraph office in Denver, which was a different kind of work. Than operating had been more administrative, more about systems and personnel than about the signal itself, though. She still sat at the keys sometimes when she had reason to, and found that it was the same, that the signal was still the signal, and her hands still knew it. She had agreed to the interview because the professor's letter had described the project in terms that she recognized as honest, the actual attempt to record what had happened, rather than the version of it that was easier to say. She had been interviewed before by people who wanted a different kind of story, something with cleaner edges and a more obvious lesson, and she had found those conversations useless, in a way she could not always articulate at the time, but could articulate now. She told him about Harrow Creek. She told him about the wagon to Fort Bowie and the warehouse and the high windows in the floor. She told him about Rosamond and Millicent and the night she stood up and crossed the room to a soldier and stated a fact and waited to see what happened. She told him what happened. He asked her what she had taken away from it. He asked the question and then stopped, as was his habit, and she understood that he was leaving room. She thought about it for a moment. She thought about the address in her coat pocket, still there worn soft along the folds after 17 years. She thought about the clock face Ingram had drawn, and the paper Ashworth had pressed into her hand, and the way Millicent had placed her palm flat on her chest in the afternoon light when the letter arrived. She said, "I went in thinking that the act of asking would determine the response, that if I asked the wrong way or from the wrong position or at the wrong moment, the system would use it against me. I had evidence for that. It was not an irrational position." He waited. She said, "What I learned is that the act of asking is not the determining factor. The people who receive the ask are the determining factor, and you cannot know who they are until you ask, which means the only way to know is to do the thing you are afraid to do and then see who is on the other side of it." He wrote this down. She said, "That sounds like a simple lesson." It isn't. I spent 6 months after Fort Bowie still doing the calculation every time I needed something, still asking myself whether the asking would make things worse. The habit doesn't change because you have one piece of contradictory evidence. It changes slowly. Each time you ask and the response is not what you feared, the calculation shifts a fraction. After enough fractions, you find one day that you've been asking without calculating that the assumption has changed underneath you while you were paying attention to other things. He asked, and the people on the other side, the soldier, the doctor, do you think about them? She said, I think about Thornton, specifically. I think about the fact that he was 20 years old and had been given no instruction covering the situation he was in, and he looked at it anyway and did what seemed right to him in the moment. Not because anyone was watching, not because the regulations required it in any immediate sense, because he looked at a woman who was sick and he had the ability to do something about it, and so he did. She paused. She said there is a version of the world in which he doesn't do that, in which he calculates the same way I was calculating whether this is his problem, whether intervening creates complications, whether the easier thing is to wait and see. That version of the world exists. I had reasons to believe it was the version I was in. He is the reason I was wrong. The professor wrote for a moment. Then he asked, do you know what became of him? She reached into her coat pocket and produced a piece of paper folded many times soft along the creases. She said, this is the address of the telegraph office in Dayton, Ohio. He gave it to me on the last day. His father worked there. She looked at it. She said, I never used it. I don't know if his father still works there. I don't know if Thornton stayed in the Army or came home or is anywhere near Dayton. I kept the address because it was given in good faith, and I find I'm not willing to discard things given in good faith even when they're no longer practically useful. The professor looked at the paper and then at her. She folded it again and returned it to her pocket. She said, I also kept a piece of paper that a young private named Ashworth gave me. He had written the date and time of the moment Thornton left the building to find help and my name, and he said he thought someone should have a record. She said in 1889, I read a newspaper article about military policy and women in conflict zones written by a man in Cincinnati who did not give his name. I recognized the events he described. I wrote to the newspaper. They forwarded my letter. The man wrote back. His name was Wendell Ashworth. She let that sit for a moment. She said he became a journalist. He told me the article had been read by people in Washington. He told me it had contributed to a change in processing guidelines issued in 1891, a new section in the Army's procedures covering civilian women in military zones. He said it was a small change. He said most people would never know it was there. She said, I think about that sometimes. The line of it, a woman sick in a storage room, a soldier who decided it was his concern, a doctor who came because he was asked and came back because it was right, a girl who asked a question about families when she was leaving an interrogation room, and a boy with a notebook who wrote down the date and time because he thought accurate records mattered. And all of it traveling forward through years until it became a line in a document that no one reads unless they need it, and when they need it, it is there. She looked at the professor. She said, that is what I think about when I think about Fort Bowie. Not the fear, not the uncertainty, not even the relief which was real and which I won't diminish. I think about the specific chain of small decisions made by ordinary people who did not know they were making history and were not trying to. They were just doing the next thing, the thing directly in front of them. She said my father told me once that the telegraph works because every station along the line does its job. Not the exceptional ones, not the famous ones. Every station, the whole length of the wire. She looked out the window for a moment at the Denver street below the horses and wagons in the clear, cold afternoon light. November again, the same season it had been when the wagons carried them out of Fort Bowie toward a road they could see the end of for the first time. She said I spent a long time thinking the wire was broken. It isn't always broken. Sometimes you just haven't sent the signal yet. Outside the window, the afternoon was going on with its business. Somewhere to the south, a telegraph line ran through the territory she had come from, carrying its signals in both directions, carrying information from people who needed it to travel toward people who could receive it. The whole length of the wire doing its job in the way that things do their jobs when the people along the line have decided each in their own moment and for their own reasons that doing it matters. The professor closed his notebook. She put on her coat and the folded paper in her pocket pressed its familiar, soft weight against her hand, and she walked out into the light.